Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. So, today's case takes us to Glasgow, Scotland back in 2004, which, side note, here's a fun fact. That's actually anything but fun. Glasgow used to carry the ominous title of the murder capital of Europe, and not by a small margin either. At one point, this city was known more for violence than for bagpipes and rain. Belfast in Northern Ireland wasn't far behind. Either it ranked as one of the most dangerous cities in Europe at the time. But okay, let's put the murderous geography lesson to bed for now, because today's story doesn't actually begin in 2004. It starts decades earlier in 1968. That was the year Edith McAlindon was born. Now, the early chapters of Edith's life are a bit of a mystery. We don't know much about her childhood, her family, or what kind of home she grew up in. But what we do know is that she was raised in Glasgow. And the first time we really start to learn more about her story is when she turned 18. That's when Edith fell pregnant with her first child. She gave birth to a baby boy and named him John. And by all accounts, Edith was a fiercely devoted mother. She loved her son deeply and gave everything she had to raise him the best way she could. But love alone doesn't put food on the table, and for Edith, money was always tight. Some nights, heartbreakingly, she couldn't afford to feed both herself and John. In those desperate moments, Edith turned to whatever she could to survive. She began stealing, and when that wasn't enough, she resorted to prostitution. Not because she wanted to, but because she felt she had no other option. And yes, this landed her in trouble with the police more than once. She was caught stealing time and time again. But it's important to understand, Edith was never some hardened criminal. She wasn't running scams or planning elaborate thefts. She was simply a young mother doing whatever she could to keep her child alive. Unfortunately, the law didn't see it that way. She was in and out of jail, often arrested for petty crimes, and during those times when she was behind bars, it's unclear where little John went. As far as we know, Edith didn't have close family, no parents or siblings to step in. So one can only imagine the instability, the confusion, the fear that must have surrounded that child. And every time she was released from jail, Edith found herself starting from zero again. No home, no job, no money, just her and her son, alone. They spent many nights on the street, curling up wherever they could find a sliver of shelter. If she managed to scrape together enough change, they might get a spot in a hostel or homeless shelter. But more often than not, the cold pavement was their bed. Eventually though, things got not better, but slightly less terrible. Over time, Edith built a sort of support network, friends, acquaintances, people who knew her situation, and offered small acts of kindness. Someone might lend her a couch to sleep on for the night, or give her a few pounds so she and John could stay in a shelter. It wasn't stability, but it was something. It was a tiny patch of safety in an otherwise brutal world. It was during this time, bouncing from shelter to shelter, always trying to stay one step ahead of hunger, that Edith met a man named David Gillespie. He was in much the same boat as she was, homeless, struggling, surviving day by day. The two of them struck up a conversation one evening, and something just clicked. They shared a kind of understanding that only people who've been through the same darkness can really grasp. They made each other laugh, they listened to each other's stories, and very quickly they became close, first as friends, then as a couple. Now, David never took on the role of a father figure to John. That wasn't really the dynamic. But his presence still made a difference. With him, Edith had someone, a partner, to face the world with. Someone who could help carry the weight of survival. And for a while, this made things a little easier. They still didn't have a home, or jobs, or much money. But they had each other. They could pool what little they had. If one had no food, maybe the other did. If one had nowhere to go, maybe the other found a spot for the night. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over time, Edith and David made two more friends, Ian Mitchell and Anthony Coyle. Ian was 67. Anthony was 71. Both of them had been friends for decades, old-timers who knew the streets of Glasgow as well as anyone. Despite the age gap, the four of them got on surprisingly well. Maybe it was their shared struggle. Maybe it was just that when life's been unkind to you for long enough, you learn to hold on to the people who treat you like family. And in a way, that's what they became, a patchwork family, built not from blood but from survival. Ian and Anthony, those two older men who had become part of Edith and David's circle, were both retired. And interestingly enough, both of them had gone through divorces earlier in life. So when they found themselves single again in their older years, they kind of just looked at each other and went, well, should we just move in together? It made perfect sense. It would be cheaper, safer, and let's be honest, a lot less lonely. So Ian bought a modest flat and Anthony moved in, renting one of the bedrooms. That little flat would soon become something more than just a shared space. It became a kind of home base for their small makeshift community. It was the place they always returned to, the place they gathered, talked, drank, laughed. That flat became the beating heart of their social lives. And at this point, Edith's life actually seemed like it was getting better. She had a boyfriend. She had friends she trusted. She had a place, not her own, but a place where she felt welcome. But then came January 2004, and with it, a new twist in Edith's story. At the age of 36, Edith McCollendon found herself in serious trouble again. This time, it wasn't petty theft. It wasn't sleeping rough or struggling to find money. This time, it was a violent assault charge, serious enough to earn her a 9-month prison sentence. And frustratingly, the details of that assault are unclear. There's nothing concrete about what actually happened, no articles, no official statements, nothing to explain the full story. But whatever it was bad enough for the court to take her off the streets for nearly a year. While Edith was serving time, her boyfriend David Gillespie surprisingly started getting his life together. He was 42 by then, and without Edith by his side, something in him seemed to shift. He applied for long-term accommodation and managed to secure a room at the Alexander Thompson Hotel in Glasgow City Centre. It wasn't fancy, but it was permanent. He finally had a real address, something he hadn't had in years. For David, this was a turning point. With an address, doors opened. He could start applying for jobs, meeting new people, and maybe, just maybe, start building a more stable life for himself. And then came the 16th of October, 2004, the day Edith was released from prison. Before she even stepped out through the gates, she called David from the prison phone. She was buzzing with excitement. She asked where he was, where he'd be, and he told her, "I'm at Ian and Anthony's flat. We're having a drink. Come join us." To Edith, this sounded perfect. A casual reunion, familiar faces, a little celebration. She was all in. So she got out, made her way straight to the flat, and when she arrived, all 3 men were already deep in their drinks. They were heavy drinkers, all of them. And Edith, not wanting to waste a second of her first day of freedom, jumped right in. She was knocking back drinks, trying to catch up. By all appearances, she was having a good time. By their standards, that is, it was a perfect day. But that good mood didn't last long. After a few hours, the alcohol was gone. They'd finished everything. Now, all 4 of them were broke, and nobody wanted to be the one to go get more. They were each hoping someone else would step up, but nobody did. Money was always tight, and everyone was reluctant to part with what little they had left. And that's when the mood started to shift. Edith was hurt and angry. This was her first day out of prison. She hadn't had a drink, or even a real moment of joy, in 9 long months. All she wanted was for someone, anyone, to celebrate with her. But her friends just sat there, arms crossed, saying things like, "Well, we bought the first round before you even got here. Why should we buy more? It's someone else's turn now. Not my problem." The more they talked, the more Edith seethed. To her, it wasn't just about the booze. It was about the principle. She had just walked out of jail, desperate for some sense of normalcy, some welcome, some kindness, and instead, her friends were turning into tight-fisted strangers. The argument got louder, meaner, more personal. Edith started shouting, then screaming. Her words got sharper, her voice more frantic. The tension in that little flat began to swell. And then suddenly, everything snapped. In the middle of her shouting, Edith's eyes caught sight of something in the kitchen, a knife, sitting on the counter, and she didn't even hesitate. Before anyone could stop her, she rushed forward, grabbed the knife with one hand, spun around, and looked at David, her boyfriend. And without saying a single word, Edith brought the knife down and stabbed into David's thigh over and over and over again. Here's what they didn't realize right away. When Edith stabbed David, she didn't just hurt him. She severed his femoral vein, a major blood vessel in the upper leg. And because David had been drinking all day, his blood had thinned dramatically. So the second that knife pierced his skin, the bleeding became catastrophic. He was losing blood fast. Within moments, the flat went from noisy and drunk to frozen in terror. David collapsed. Blood soaked through his clothes and poured onto the floor. Edith finally stopped. Her grip on the knife loosened, her chest heaving. She looked up at Ian and Anthony, and they were frozen. Their faces had gone pale. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. No one said a word. But all of them knew the truth. This was bad. They could see where she had stabbed him. They could see how much blood he was losing. And they all knew exactly what that meant. David might die. Without even discussing it, Ian and Anthony snapped into action. They began frantically rushing around the flat, looking for anything they could use to stop the bleeding, towels, rags, shirts, anything. They pressed them against the wounds, trying to hold the blood in, trying to slow it down, trying not to panic. And Edith, something inside her changed. The rage that had taken her over, that blinding fury, it was gone. Now she realized what she had just done. She saw the chaos. She saw the blood. She saw her boyfriend lying there, and it all hit her at once. She told the men quickly, "I'm gonna grab my phone. I'll call for help." And for a moment, Ian and Anthony thought, okay, good. They thought an ambulance would be on its way. David would get the help he needed. There was still time. But that wasn't what Edith meant. When she said call for help, she didn't mean emergency services, because she knew exactly what she'd done and what that meant for her. She had just stabbed a man over and over. There would be serious consequences, possibly prison, maybe worse, and Edith couldn't face that. So instead of calling 999, she called her son, John. He was 17 years old, just a teenager. She told him she needed help and asked him to come to the flat. What kind of help? What did she expect him to do? No one really knows. Because honestly, Edith probably didn't know either. She was panicking, her mind was racing, she just needed someone. Anyone. John got in a taxi right away, and he didn't come alone. He brought along one of his school friends, 16-year-old Jamie Gray. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, things were falling apart. There was still blood, still shouting. David was barely conscious, and no one had called for medical help. And when John and Jamie walked in, it didn't help. Their presence only made the situation worse. Because Ian and Anthony, they were furious. They couldn't believe it. Instead of calling an ambulance, instead of trying to save David's life, Edith had called her teenage son and his school friend. What were they supposed to do? How were two kids supposed to save a dying man? It was ridiculous. And just when it felt like things couldn't spiral any further, they did. Because when John and Jamie had rushed across Glasgow in that taxi, they didn't have money to pay for it. So what did they do? They just got out and left, walked away, left the driver unpaid and angry. And that taxi driver, rightfully furious, began causing a scene. He was outside the apartment, beeping his horn, yelling, demanding payment. And now, inside the flat, everyone was panicking for a different reason. Because they knew that kind of commotion would draw attention. Neighbors might look out their windows, someone might call the police. And the last thing any of them wanted right now was more eyes on what had happened. So they were like, shit, we need to go downstairs, talk to him, try and smooth this out. We can't draw our attention to the situation right now. So just like that, they all left. Left David Gillespie bleeding out on the floor, barely alive, and instead of calling an ambulance or even checking back on him, the whole group went downstairs to argue with a taxi driver. This driver, understandably, was making a scene out front. He was yelling, blasting the horn, drawing attention. And inside this chaotic mess, no one wanted to admit responsibility for the fare. Edith kept repeating that she had no money. John and Jamie said they had none either. No one was willing to pay up. And so the argument dragged on longer than it ever should have, until Ian Mitchell finally gave in. Now, to be fair, Ian didn't immediately offer to pay. He tried to resist. He argued, complained, made it very clear he didn't want to part with his cash. But somewhere in the middle of that back and forth, it hit him. Wait, my friend is dying upstairs. And only then did he sigh, pull out his wallet, and hand over the money. Now look, no one's saying they didn't struggle financially. They did. Every single person in that group was broke, barely scraping by. But even then, when your friend is literally bleeding to death just meters above your head, why is there even a debate over a taxi fare? Ian paid, sure. But the second they started walking back up those stairs, he wouldn't let it go. He complained the entire way, going on and on about how he had to be the one to pay, how it wasn't fair, how he didn't even want to get involved in the first place. And it was during this climb back up the stairs that reality really began to set in. Ian and Anthony both stopped mentally, not physically, and realized something. There was no siren. No ambulance lights flickering through the window, no footsteps in the hallway. That's when it hit them. No one was coming. Edith hadn't called for help. She hadn't called 999. She hadn't even tried. She had called her son, and only her son. There was no help on the way. And now they were starting to panic. They had left David upstairs, bleeding, in critical condition. And they were all just now realizing they were on their own. The group raced back up the stairs, pushing past one another, hoping, begging that it wasn't too late. But it was. By the time they got there, David Gillespie was already gone. He had bled to death while they stood outside, arguing over taxi money. John and Jamie, who had just arrived minutes earlier, were in complete shock. This was the first time they had stepped foot in the flat. When Edith called her son, she hadn't said what the emergency was. She didn't mention a stabbing, didn't say anyone was hurt. She just said, "I need help." So when John and Jamie walked in and saw the scene, the blood, the body, the panic, they were horrified. They had no idea what they were walking into. Jamie, being just 16, froze. But John, now 17, a bit older, somehow kept his composure. He took his mother aside and spoke to her in a low, serious voice, not panicking, not emotional, just cold, calculated survival. He said something like, "You just got out of prison this morning, you served 9 months. But if they find out what you did today, that you murdered someone, you're going back inside. For life." And then he looked her in the eye and said what no teenage son should ever have to say. "You need to figure out how you're going to hide the body and how you're going to get away with this." Then he pointed toward Ian and Anthony. He reminded Edith that those two men had seen everything. They were witnesses, and worse, they were David's friends. Of course, they tell the police what happened. And in that moment, Edith knew. She understood exactly what her son was trying to say. Edith understood what her son was trying to say with this. She knew that something had to be done about Ian and Anthony. So now, with David Gillespie dead on the floor, the flat, thick, with tension and panic, the three of them, Edith, her 17-year-old son John, and his teenage friend Jamie, began to turn their attention to the only problem left in the room, the two witnesses, Ian and Anthony. It didn't take long for the idea to surface. They all understood it without saying much at all. If Ian and Anthony were left alive, they would go to the police. They had seen everything. They could describe what happened. They could point directly to the killer. So the conclusion was simple. They had to go too. The three of them didn't even try to make a proper plan. They didn't sit down to weigh their options or whisper back and forth about how to do it quietly. Number. They didn't need a plan. Because in that apartment, they had the numbers. 3 of them. Only 2 of the men. And Ian and Anthony, well, they were both elderly, in their late 60s and early 70s. There was no doubt in Edith, John, or Jamie's mind. They could overpower them easily. All they had to do was act fast. Don't say a word, just move. And that's exactly what they did. Ian and Anthony had no idea what was coming. They were just sitting on the sofa next to each other, talking, probably still trying to process what had happened to their friend. Maybe wondering whether they should go to the police. They had no clue that more violence was about to erupt, that this night of horror was far from over. So when John McAlinden stepped into the kitchen, none of them even noticed. He quietly grabbed a knife, just like his mother had done earlier. And then he walked calmly back into the room, sat down next to Ian Mitchell, and without hesitation, launched forward. He began stabbing Ian directly in the chest, again and again and again. There was no build-up, no warning, just blood and screaming. Anthony, who had been sitting on the other side of the room, panicked instantly. He jumped up and ran as fast as he could into one of the bedrooms. He locked the door, pushed furniture up against it, did whatever he could to keep them out. But right now, they weren't worried about Anthony. He was trapped. They knew he wasn't going anywhere. For now, their focus stayed on Ian. By the time they were done stabbing him, Ian was likely already dead. But just to be sure, just to erase all doubt, they decided to go further. All three of them, Edith, John, and Jamie, took turns kicking Ian in the head, again and again, to make sure he was really dead. There was no mercy, no hesitation. And when they finally stopped, Edith turned to her son and said, "Now it's time to find Anthony." But John wasn't so sure. Something in him was still buzzing with paranoia. He wasn't convinced that Ian was dead, or even David. He began saying things like, "What if they're faking it? What if they're just unconscious or pretending to be dead, so we'll leave?" To anyone else, that probably would have sounded ridiculous. But to John, it felt like a real risk, a loose end that had to be dealt with. So he came up with a plan to test it. A way to know for sure. He walked back to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and boiled the water. Then he brought it back over to the lifeless bodies. And one by one, he poured the scalding water directly over their heads. His logic? If either of them were still alive, even barely, they'd flinch, because no one could endure boiling water without reacting. But when he poured the water over both their heads, nothing. That, of course, meant they were already dead. Now, with two men dead, the group's attention turned to the final witness, Anthony Coyle. Anthony had managed to lock himself in one of the back bedrooms. He was terrified, but he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what was coming. He'd just heard the brutal murder of his best friend Ian, and he knew without a doubt that he was next. He may have locked the door, but in a situation like this, a basic bedroom lock wasn't going to keep anyone out for long. And the group, Edith, John, and Jamie, knew it. They moved quickly through the flat, trying to figure out how to get through the door. They were tense, but determined. And just then, Edith noticed something on the coffee table. It was Anthony's mobile phone. She pointed it out, almost mockingly. "Well, guess he couldn't call the police," she said. That little discovery only made them more confident. Because now they knew for sure. Anthony was trapped, alone in that room, and completely helpless. No phone, no help, no escape. And even worse, he wasn't just scared of what had happened. He was terrified of what was still coming. Can you imagine that? Sitting alone in a locked room, after hearing your friend being murdered, knowing you're next, and all you can do is wait. Outside the door, they were moving fast, looking for anything, a key, a tool, anything they could use to force their way in. Then, suddenly, one of them found it, an electric drill. It was the perfect tool for the job. They realized they could just unscrew the lock from the outside, take it apart piece by piece, and open the door themselves. And Anthony, he was just sitting there, listening. He could hear the whirring sound of the drill as they started working on the door. He could hear the screws being loosened. He knew with every click, every turn, that his time was running out. It's the kind of thing that feels like it only happens in horror movies. But this wasn't fiction, this was real. And it was happening. Once the lock was off, it was Jamie Gray, just 16 years old, who flung the door open. And he wasn't empty-handed. He charged into the room carrying a baseball bat. Anthony, terrified, tried to escape, but Jamie came at him immediately. He started swinging. Anthony ran. He bolted out of the bedroom, trying to get away, trying to find any exit. But Jamie followed. And as they ran through the flat, Jamie kept swinging the bat, hitting Anthony again and again. Each blow chipped away at his strength. Each strike made it harder to run. This wasn't a quick moment of violence. It was a prolonged, brutal chase. Room to room, wall to wall. Until finally, Anthony couldn't run anymore. His body gave out. He collapsed. And that's when Jamie saw his chance. He stood over him and kept hitting, again and again and again, until Anthony Coyle was dead. Anthony's death was the longest, the most painful, and easily the most terrifying of the three. And once it was done, once Anthony lay lifeless like the others, the apartment fell silent. The group, Edith, John, and Jamie, all breathed a long, collective sigh of relief, because now there were no witnesses. if they played this right, if they got rid of the bodies and cleaned everything up, there was no one left to talk, they could actually get away with this. That was the idea. But here's the thing. John and Jamie didn't want to be involved in any of that part. Not the cleanup, not the disposal, not the aftermath. They said this was Edith's mess, and she would have to be the one to deal with it. So the two boys left. And Edith, she didn't jump into action straight away. She didn't rush to start cleaning or hiding evidence. Instead, she sat. She sat there for hours. And as time passed and the alcohol wore off, reality started to settle in. The chaos, the blood, the stillness of the room, it all hit her harder and harder with each passing minute. The gravity of this situation is just setting in deeper and deeper. Now, Edith was alone in that apartment. 3 bodies, blood everywhere, and silence pressing down like a weight. She knew this wasn't something she could ignore or walk away from. She had to come up with a plan, and she did. A plan that, in her mind, seemed absolutely perfect. The first thing she did was head to the bathroom. She stood at the sink and began scrubbing herself clean. The blood was everywhere on her hands, in her hair, staining her clothes. She washed it all off. Carefully, methodically, she changed into fresh clothes. She took her time to make sure that by the time she stepped outside, she didn't look like someone who had just committed 3 murders. Then she went to the front door, took a deep breath, and knocked on a neighbor's door. Her plan? To act as though she had just arrived home, walked into the flat, and discovered the horrific scene. Around 3 a.m. on the 17th of October, 2004, a man named Jim Sweeney was startled awake by a knock at his door. When he opened it, he saw Edith McAlinden standing there. And all she said to him was, "Something bad happened." She asked him to come with her to follow her back to the apartment. And Jim, still half asleep and with no idea what he was about to walk into, agreed. From the moment he stepped into the hallway leading to the flat, Jim said his stomach started to twist. He hadn't even seen a body yet, but he could already see blood everywhere. It was on the walls, on the ceiling, in thick pools on the floor. It didn't feel real. He stopped in his tracks. Before even entering the apartment, he turned to Edith and said, "Wait here, I'm calling the police." He didn't want to walk into that room not without help, not without backup. So Jim called 999. And as police and paramedics began making their way to the flat, he and Edith stood outside together, waiting. But then, in that tense silence, curiosity or perhaps something else made them go back inside. They walked into the apartment and into the living room, and that was where Jim saw them. All 3 bodies. 2 of them were slumped on the sofa. One of them lay motionless on the ground in front of them. It was a gruesome sight. The air was thick with blood and silence. Jim paused at the threshold and then turned around to Edith, who hadn't entered yet, and told her, "Don't come in here. You don't want to see this." He knew without a doubt that these men were already dead. He could tell just by looking. There was no saving them. And he didn't want to disturb the scene any more than it already had been. So he told her, "Let's just wait outside until the police arrive." But Edith refused. She pushed past him, and the moment she saw David Gillespie's body on the floor, she collapsed over him, sobbing uncontrollably. She screamed, "Wake up! Wake up! Don't do this to me!" She clutched his body, cried into his clothes, begged him to come back. It was a full-on performance, loud, chaotic, emotional, and deeply dramatic. And when the paramedics and police finally arrived, she still hadn't let go of him. They had to physically pull her off of David's body just to begin their work. She was wailing, shaking, putting on what looked like the performance of her life. But behind all of it was something else entirely. The professionals moved quickly. They checked each of the men for vital signs. They examined the scene. And of course, all 3 of them were pronounced dead at the scene. So right after the discovery, one of the very first things police did was take Edith McAlinden down to the station. At this point, they weren't treating her as a suspect, not even close. They genuinely believed her story, that she had walked into the apartment and found the scene just like anyone else would. She was emotional, she was distraught, and her reaction as far as they could see had felt real. So they just wanted to bring her in and ask a few questions. Not an interrogation. More like an informal witness statement. They weren't suspicious of her. Not yet. But while Edith was sitting in that interview room, back at the flat, a team of crime scene investigators had begun working through the apartment. And what they were about to uncover would shake even the most hardened officers to their core. As we mentioned at the start of this case, Glasgow had a dark reputation. At one point, it had been dubbed the murder capital of Europe. So police officers in that city had seen a lot. Horrific scenes, brutal homicides, violence that would leave most people traumatized. But even by Glasgow standards, this scene was unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. Multiple senior officers, including some who had been working homicide for decades, said this was the worst crime scene they had ever stepped into. It was so gruesome, so horrifying, that even seasoned professionals had to step outside to be sick. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it was covered in blood. Everywhere they turned, there were smears, splatters, and pools. The violence in that apartment hadn't just been brief. It had been drawn out brutal, messy, and relentless. It was clear to investigators right away that these weren't quick, clean murders. They had been prolonged beatings. There had been a struggle, a fight for survival. The amount of blood across the apartment spread over every surface showed just how long the victims had been alive during their attacks. They had run. They had tried to escape. They had bled out slowly, painfully. Even more disturbingly, the bodies of Ian Mitchell and David Gillespie were found covered in Anthony Coyle's blood. That detail alone told police something crucial. Anthony had been the last to die, because for his blood to be on his friends' bodies, they must have already been dead when he was running past them, bleeding, desperate. He had been chased around the flat, around their corpses. There was no part of the apartment untouched by violence, and the condition of the victims, it was horrifying. Their bodies had been so badly beaten that one officer described them as being reduced to mashed flesh. But it didn't end there. Investigators found burns on the curtains, high up on the walls. And at first, that detail didn't make sense. Until they realized what those burns were from, fragments of skin, bone, even brain tissue had been flung so hard during the attacks that they had hit the walls with force and stuck. Tests later confirmed it. Those were pieces of skull and brain from all three victims. That's how brutal these killings were. That's how intense the violence had become. This wasn't just a triple homicide. It was a massacre. And then came the weapons. All across the apartment, police found a whole collection of items, each one of them clearly used during the attacks. Each one is still covered in blood. So here's the list. A hammer, an axe, a baseball bat, golf clubs, multiple knives, metal files, a belt, and even random chunks of wood. All of them had blood and, in some cases, chunks of flesh on them. As forensic teams continued to document the horror inside that apartment, there was one overwhelming detail that stood out even to police who had seen the worst of Glasgow's darkest years. There was so much blood, so much violence, that even the most experienced investigators admitted they couldn't be precise about everything that had happened. The blood spatter was everywhere, the floors, the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, and analyzing it was almost impossible. The patterns bled into each other, layered chaos over chaos. But they did what they could, and even in that overwhelming mess, forensic experts were able to draw one key conclusion: there was more than one killer. The angles of the blood, the points of impact, the positions of the bodies, it all pointed to multiple attackers. They theorized three people working together responsible for the massacre inside that room. And here's what they assumed. Based on the sheer force behind the killings, the suspects were male. The level of brutality, the deep wounds, the blunt trauma, the way bodies had been broken, all of it suggested immense physical strength. So naturally, they believed they were looking for strong men, capable of overpowering 3 adult victims in such a horrific manner. But even as this forensic work was unfolding, police began to question something else entirely: Edith McAlinden. At first, they didn't suspect her. They saw her grief. They saw her cling to David's body, wailing and sobbing, wake up, don't leave me." It had seemed genuine. They assumed she and David had been a couple. Everyone assumed that. And, as we know now, that was true. Edith and David had been together for years. But when police asked her directly, "Were you and David in a relationship?" she said no. She told them they were just friends. And that didn't sit right with investigators. Why lie about something like that? It was a small crack in her story, but it was enough to make them uneasy, so they kept digging. That's when they reached out to one of David's former girlfriends, a woman named Violet. And Violet didn't hold back. From the moment she got on the phone with detectives, she told them flat out, Edith was lying. She said David and Edith had been together for years. Everyone knew it. She was furious to hear what had happened to David. Devastated, in fact. But she wasn't surprised. She told police plainly that she believed Edith was dangerous, that she wasn't a good person. Violet urged them to take a closer look at Edith. And after that call, detectives began to see the story in a new light. They no longer believed Edith had just found the crime scene. They no longer believed she was just some helpless witness. No, they now believed that Edith McCallendon was deeply involved in the murders, maybe even at the center of them. But they still thought she hadn't acted alone. All the evidence still pointed to 3 killers. So if Edith was one, who were the other 2? Police tried to push her. They brought her in for more questioning. Tried to break down her story. Tried to get her to name her accomplices. But Edith wouldn't budge. She stuck to her lie, claimed she had walked in and found them like that. So the police had to go another way. They started looking at the people in Edith's life. And knowing that she and her social circle were often homeless, they turned their attention to Glasgow's hostels and shelters. They began making calls, lining up interviews, searching for leads. But before they could even finish, breaking news. Back at the station, as detectives worked through paperwork, photos, and timelines, a man walked through the front doors, a man named Brian Gallagher, and he said he needed to speak with them. The man who had just walked into the police station, Brian Gallagher, was someone the detectives had never expected. He was homeless, staying in one of Glasgow's many shelters. But now, standing in the station lobby, he looked nervous and determined. He said he needed to speak to someone urgently. When officers brought him into a side room and sat him down, Brian took a breath and told them that something had happened the night before. He said that a teenager named John McAlinden had arrived at the shelter in the early hours of the morning. He was drunk, but also strangely in a good mood. Like, really good. Brian described how John had come stumbling in, almost laughing to himself. There was a wildness in his eyes, a sort of adrenaline high. Brian glanced over at him and made a casual joke, something like, "What's got you so happy tonight?" And John turned to him, slurred and smiling, and said something that made Brian's blood run cold. He said, "Stabbed a guy in the legs, man. There was blood everywhere." He said it like it was nothing. No shame, no hesitation. Then John added something that made it even worse. "It was a fella who tried to rape my ma. I had to teach him a lesson, and I did my ma's boyfriend." Brian froze. He hadn't expected that. Not from this teenager he vaguely knew. He just sat there, still, not moving, not speaking, barely breathing. Because in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear. If John could do that to someone else, he could do it to Brian too. So he stayed quiet. He didn't ask questions. He didn't react. He just let John keep talking. And John did. Still drunk, still talking fast. John kept referring to someone in the story as my brother. Over and over, my brother did this. Me and my brother. And it confused Brian. Because he knew John. And he knew that John didn't have a brother. Not a real one anyway. But still, Brian didn't ask. He didn't push for answers. Eventually, John ran out of steam. He passed out right there in the shelter on the bed next to Brian's. Brian sat there in silence, processing what he had just heard. This wasn't just some drunken rant. This was a confession. And Brian knew exactly what he needed to do. He grabbed his bag, packed his things, and ran. Straight to the police station. He didn't stop. And when he walked through those station doors and told officers what had just happened, it was minutes after that conversation with John. Now here's what made this so important. When Brian came forward, the case hadn't even made it to the news yet. It was too fresh. The crime scene had just been discovered, There had been no public coverage, no media attention. There was no way Brian could have known any of the details, unless he'd heard them directly from one of the killers. And everything he told the police matched up perfectly. The way the victims had been killed, the mention of the stabbing, the blood, the connection to Edith. It was all there. It was all the exact same. Later that same day, after Brian Gallagher gave his chilling statement, police made their move. They located and arrested 17-year-old John McCallendon. And shortly after, they tracked down his friend 16-year-old Jamie Gray and arrested him too. Now they had all three suspects in custody, Edith, John, and Jamie. Each of them was asked to provide DNA samples, which were then matched against the evidence collected from the apartment, the blood-stained weapons, the splatter patterns, the surfaces, the victims' bodies. And the results came back clear. All three were a match. There was no doubt anymore. The forensic evidence confirmed it. They were the killers. That was the final piece police needed to move forward. All three were officially charged with the murders of Ian Mitchell, Anthony Coyle, and David Gillespie. And they were all scheduled to stand trial in 2005. When that trial finally began, about 8 months had passed since the murders. During that entire time, the three of them had been kept in separate custody. No contact, no communication. They hadn't seen each other since the night of the murders. So when they were reunited for the first time in the courtroom, they didn't act how you'd expect accused murderers to behave. There were no grim faces, no remorse, no fear. Instead, they smiled. They laughed. They giggled, waved, exchanged glances as if they were at some sort of reunion. This wasn't a courtroom for them. It felt like a schoolyard. They did all of this with the families of their victims sitting just a few feet away. Then the prosecution began. And every graphic detail of what had happened in that apartment, the violence, the torture, the horror, was laid out piece by piece for the court to hear. Here's just one quote from the prosecutor. The victims had been beaten with knives, metal files, a belt, and pieces of wood. They were hit with a bottle, punched, stabbed, and stamped on the head, and they had boiling water poured all over them. But that wasn't all. The prosecution also called a surprise witness. No one in the room knew they were coming, not the defense, not even some of the court staff. It was the downstairs neighbor, the woman who had lived just beneath the house of blood. She took the stand and told the court that on the night of the murders, her ceiling shook violently. The sounds from upstairs had been so loud, so violent, that she said it felt like a thunderstorm was happening above her head. Running, banging, screaming. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't block it out. It was chaos. But perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence presented at trial was the body cam footage. Police had recorded their first moment stepping into that apartment. And now, the jury and everyone else in the courtroom was about to see it. Before the video played, they were warned, told to brace themselves. Because nothing had been cleaned, the bodies were still there, the weapons were still there, the blood was still fresh. And so they watched. They watched the officers walking from room to room. They saw the pools of blood. They saw the three mutilated bodies, the brains spilled across the floor, the torn flesh, the shattered bones. The courtroom sat in silence, gripped with horror. The prosecution even brought in the actual weapons used in the attack. Some of them still had pieces of flesh attached. No one could believe what they were seeing. Some of the jurors looked away. Others cried. And then the prosecution paused the video. They pointed to something lying on the floor, clumps of hair. Hair that had been ripped out during the attack. Later confirmed to be Anthony Coyle's. Police believed it had been pulled out as he tried to run, his killers grabbing at him, yanking him back by the hair. And after all of this, after hours of the most overwhelming, undeniable evidence, all three suspects, Edith, John, and Jamie, changed their plea. They retracted their claims of innocence. And instead, they each pled guilty because they knew there was no way they were getting away with this. It's like they saw all that evidence presented in front of them. But here's the thing. They had a plan. And as much as it pains me to admit this, it was actually kind of smart. Most likely cooked up by their legal teams, the plan was simple. Split the charges. Instead of all three of them confessing to all three murders, which would make them triple murderers, They each decided to claim responsibility for just one. So Edith McAlendon stood up and said, "Yes, I killed David Gillespie, my boyfriend." Then John McAlendon followed. "Fine, I murdered Ian Mitchell." And finally Jamie Gray added, "Yeah, I killed Anthony Coyle." Now, was this true? Of course not. We all know that all three of them participated in all three murders. They planned together, they executed together, they brutalized these men together. But legally, it was hard to disprove the division they offered. And in the end, the court accepted it because, well, at least they were confessing. At least there were guilty pleas. That counted for something. And the strategy? It worked. Because by pleading guilty and only to one murder each, they avoided full responsibility and ended up with slightly reduced sentences. Here's how it broke down. Edith McAlendon was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 13 years. That made her eligible for parole in 2018. Although there's no public record of her being released, she may still be behind bars, or she may be out. Let's hope it's the first one. For reference, she's 53 years old now. Not sure where to drop that detail, but there you go. John McAlendon and Jamie Gray also received life sentences, but their minimums were set at 12 years, 1 year less than Edith's. Why the difference? According to the judge, Edith was considered the catalyst, the reason this entire thing happened. Because even though John and Jamie carried out brutal acts, Edith was the one who made the call. She brought them into it. Without her, none of it would have happened. Even as the sentencing was read out, even after being told they would spend the rest of their lives in prison, the three of them laughed. They smiled, they waved to each other, they acted like it was all one big joke. Violet, David Gillespie's ex-girlfriend, the one who had helped expose Edith, was in the courtroom. And she watched as the three of them walked down the stairs, laughing, like this wasn't real. Like they hadn't just destroyed 3 lives and shattered countless more. Violet later said, "There are animals on the street that are better than these people. They are scum." And so, all 3 were sent off to separate prisons, locked away where they belonged. But even there, the story didn't end. Because Edith had a plan for prison life too. I mean, let's be honest, prison is a dangerous place. You don't want to look weak. You don't want to be seen as someone who can be walked all over. And Edith, she wasn't about to let that happen. She was determined to go in there and establish dominance. So, what did she do? She started bragging. She told the other inmates, "I'm the Edith McAlendon from the House of Blood." She thought she was a celebrity. She believed that by flaunting what she'd done, people would fear her, respect her, obey her. She imagined that her reputation would make her untouchable. But it didn't quite go that way. Because here's the truth. No one in prison cares. Everyone in there has done something bad, horrible things. And bragging about it, it doesn't make you scary. It makes you annoying. The other prisoners weren't impressed. They didn't see her as some infamous figure. They saw her as someone who wouldn't shut up. And soon enough, they started telling her to do just that. They warned her, stop talking about it. And when she didn't, they threatened violence. Some of the women said flat out, "If you don't stop calling yourself the woman from the House of Blood, we're going to beat you." Because they'd had enough. She wasn't special. She wasn't powerful. And no one cared about her horror story. If she didn't stop referring to herself as the woman from the House of Blood. Eventually, after all the chaos and arrogance that marked her early months in prison, Edith McAlendon began to settle. She learned slowly how to stop drawing attention to herself, how to blend in a little more, how to be less annoying. But even in there, Edith somehow found companionship, someone who could match her darkness. Her name was Pamela Gorley, though she was better known by her infamous nickname, the Bedsit Butcher. Pamela had been locked up for a murder of her own, one that shocked the country. She slit her neighbor's throat multiple times, then left her body crumpled behind the door of her tiny bedsit flat, waiting for police to eventually stumble upon the horror. When Edith met Pamela in prison, something clicked. They got along too well. They began a relationship. 2 women, both capable of horrifying violence, now joined by something disturbingly intimate. There's not much known about how or when it ended. But here's the twist. Pamela Gorley is out now. She's free. Not only that, she seems to be doing just fine. She reportedly got a husband, a job, a house, and a dog. Maybe even kids. No one's really sure. But what is certain is this. She's out there, living life like she never slit someone's throat. Like none of it ever happened. Which is terrifying in itself. But let's go back to Edith, who, as far as we know, is still in prison. And during her time inside, she has maintained one relationship consistently, the one with her son, John McAlendon, also locked up. The two write to each other often, and those letters, they reveal a lot. They show us exactly how these two people, mother and son, really feel about what they did. And the answer is simple. No remorse. Not even a little. They don't regret the murders. They don't grieve for the lives they destroyed. They don't even pretend to feel guilt. To them, this is just a nuisance, just a frustrating detour in the life they feel entitled to. Here are two direct quotes from their letters. Keep the grin above the chin. And another, we've lost our freedom and gained fuck all, but we keep smiling, so fuck them all. In 2012, Edith McAlendon was still serving her sentence behind bars when prison authorities assigned her a new cellmate, a woman named Anne. Anne was nothing like Edith. She was vulnerable, quiet, and anxious. She wasn't serving a long sentence, just a minor theft charge. A few months inside. That's it. But for some reason, someone somewhere in the system thought it was a good idea to put this frightened, first-time offender in a cell with a woman responsible for one of the worst killings Glasgow had ever seen. Well, okay, officially, Edith had only been convicted of one murder. But we know better than that. We know what she did. And when Anne moved into that cell, Edith devoured her. Not physically, but psychologically. She turned Anne into her personal servant. She manipulated her, threatened her, blackmailed her. She stole her medications, took whatever money Anne had, and used it to buy snacks and supplies from the prison canteen. Edith had no shame. She dominated Anne completely. Anne later said that being in jail wasn't the worst part of her sentence. It was being locked in a room with Edith McAlendon. She lived in constant fear of violence. Not from other inmates, not from guards, from her cellmate. Meanwhile, John McAlendon had taken a very different approach to prison. He kept his head down, stayed out of trouble, played the game, and it worked. In 2016, he was released a year early. It wasn't much, but it was something. And once he got out, John didn't waste time getting back to normal life. He met a woman, Lauren Cassidy, and very quickly, he fell head over heels. They started dating. And, surprisingly, John was open with her about his past. He told her about the murders, about the trial, about prison, and Lauren, she accepted it. She believed that John had changed, that his actions had come from a place of pain. After all, he had once claimed in that drunken confession to Brian Gallagher that he had killed to protect his mother after a man allegedly tried to rape her. Now, we don't know if that was true. There's nothing official to support it, no documentation, no reports, and maybe John said it to justify what he'd done, or maybe it was real. We don't know. And honestly, that part of the story is frustratingly thin. That's all that's ever been written about it. But anyway, Lauren believed him. She was willing to leave the past in the past. For a while, the relationship seemed solid, but it didn't last. What began as a second chance quickly turned dark. Because John once again began showing who he really was, the relationship became toxic, then abusive. And this time, it was John who was in control. He manipulated Lauren, emotionally, mentally. At first, it was small, passive aggression, subtle guilt tripping. But then, like it always does, it escalated. Until everything, all the manipulation, all the violence, came to a head in July of 2018. One night, sometime after his release, John McAlendon was seen out in public with Lauren Cassidy. It was around 1 a.m. in the heart of Glasgow city center. A passerby noticed them arguing, and something about the situation didn't sit right. So this witness decided to stick around just to see if things would settle down or if they'd escalate. And unfortunately, they escalated. That bystander ended up witnessing something horrific. John began kicking Lauren over and over, in public, in the middle of the street, screaming at her, yelling, "Get out of my fucking way, you bitch!" Thankfully, this witness had already picked up on the danger and called the police immediately. Officers arrived quickly. They intervened. But, and this is the part that hurts, Lauren didn't want to press charges, and because of that, nothing ever came of it. No charges, no consequences. John walked away again. I honestly don't know if John and Lauren are still together today. I looked, I searched. There's nothing out there that confirms either way, but for Lauren's sake, I truly hope they're not, because John has shown time and time again that he hasn't changed, not even a little. The same violence he showed the night he helped murder 3 men, it's still in him. He's not reformed. He's not healed. He's still dangerous. And that's the truth about people like John McAlendon. Men like him don't change. People who abuse, who manipulate, control, and harm others don't just wake up one day and become kind. If you're listening to this right now and you see pieces of your relationship in Lauren's story, if you feel afraid, trapped, silenced, please get out. There is help out there. There are people who will listen. You do not have to stay, because no matter how hopeless it feels, you deserve safety. You deserve peace. You deserve better. So please get some help.